Hello, everybody. This is the Weekly Witchcast for July 26th, 2024. I'm excited. We're going to get into it in a bit. Today, I'm talking a bit about my personal story, what kind of led me here, how did I become the Millennial Money Witch, the basics of manifestation that I learned, and how that ultimately led me to my own principles of money manifestation. So I'm just going to give everyone a chance to log in so that way people can ask questions if they want. I'm always excited for these because anytime I can engage with my audience and talk to them about what they're dealing with, things like that, I'm always jazzed. Okay, looks like we're live. I am assuming my audio is all good and that you'll tell me if that's not the case. So, looks like we've got someone tuned in. I'm pumped about it. Let's kick off. So, who am I? I'm Jessie De Silva. I'm the Millennial Money Witch. You may know me from my viral TikToks, from my coverage in Forbes, things like that. And my book, The Witch's Way to Wealth, the Every Witch's Guide to Making More Money Faster and Easier Than Ever. And I'm super excited to be talking with you today. I'm going to give a little bit about my personal story and some of the foundational principles before we dive into some more advanced stuff in the coming weeks. So, without further ado, let's do this, right? Okay. Many moons ago, in a past life, not really in a past life, like a past life in this lifetime. Before I became the Millennial Money Witch, before I started my business, before I embarked on this journey, I started out, I was a lawyer and a journalist. I had two very respectable careers that had nothing at all to do with witchcraft, magic, manifestation, none of that. Okay, it was all business. Although I was always the witchy friend. That's something I'll put out there. I've always been the witchy friend, the witchy sibling. I've always been like, oh no, Mercury is retrograde. Make sure that you drive extra careful now, things like that. I was always telling people about their astrology. I had tarot cards, etc. So, about a little over 5 years ago now, I went through what I now call a spiritual reawakening because I'm naturally very intuitive. And back during that time, I still had a very strong connection with my clairsentience, meaning my ability to have like psychic feelings. And by feelings, I mean like emotions. I was always able to pick up on what people were feeling, what they were experiencing. And sometimes I would get bursts of even like physical sensations. So true, like actual feeling, typically emotional, but it could run the gamut. And it was something that happened. It was something that like I naturally followed. I just kind of saw it as a way to relate to people. And it made me a good lawyer, made me a good journalist. But it wasn't something that I had any kind of control over. But around this time, it was probably around like May, June 2019. And at that time, I just started having all of these really weird coincidences happening. It was like it wasn't just like people would call me and like when I was thinking about them, or I'd get a text from somebody when I was like remembering a time with them. It wasn't just those kind of standard things. It was taking it like to the next level, to the point where I would have conversations with people and days later some completely unrelated person would say my words back to me from that previous conversation or the other person's things back to me. I also would have these like prophetic dreams, which are not as crazy it sounds because it was like always really mundane things that I would be dreaming about, but they would happen a couple weeks or a few days later. And I was like, something weird is happening here. Like this is like more than what I've experienced in the past. Like, what is this all about? So I start researching, I start Googling to see like what's happening. And I see people talking about this along with like repeating numbers, which I was seeing. And I wasn't even just seeing them as like typical numbers. I was seeing 5 5 everywhere. 5 5 5 5 5, just like fives everywhere. To the point where I've never been somebody who really notices name brands or things like that. And I went from never really seeing any kind of design or anything. I was living in DC at the time, so obviously like taking the metro to work. And all of a sudden I kept seeing Louis Vuitton bags everywhere with like the LV. And I was like, why do I keep seeing Louis Vuitton bags constantly? What is this about? And it occurred to me LV and Roman numerals is 55. I was like, oh my God, it's another form of this same number that I keep getting. So I Google it and I learned that when you have all of these synchronicities, as I later learned was the term, happening, it can often be a signal that you are developing some kind of intuitive gifts, that you are having a spiritual awakening. And now I look at it as a reawakening because, like I said, I was always really naturally intuitive, even as a child. And over the years, I had learned to kind of shut that down for my specific careers and the people I was around. And so I think this really ended up being an invitation back into that part of myself. So I started researching and I stumbled along a podcast. I stumbled across a podcast called So You Think You're Intuitive with Natalie Miles. And Natalie is a very gifted psychic. I do not know her personally, but she's a psychic out of Vancouver. She's British. She's very awesome. I love her. And her podcast, which has since changed and kind of become a psychic forecast podcast, but back in the day, her podcast was the typical like tell it like teaching you lessons and then having guests now and then. And she explains that her standalone podcast episodes were designed to be a course that you could take to get in touch with your spiritual gifts. So it started out with like early episodes were about like grounding, how to turn your psychic skills off and on, things like that. So I started listening and I started practicing. I was like leaning into these gifts. I went from kind of like reading tarot every so often, like for funsies and like only looking into the little guidebooks that I had. Went from that to like actually using it as a self reflection tool for myself. I started developing some spiritual practices to help me with these gifts that I was developing. And well, rather not developing, that I was becoming reacquainted with. I'll put it that way. And one of the episodes, one of the early ones with a guest that she had was Lacey Phillips of To Be Magnetic. And if you don't know them, they're a huge manifestation membership platform and brand. And that was like my first exposure to manifestation, really, beyond the typical 2000s thing of like The Secret and whatnot. So Lacey has put forth this formula based partially in neuroscience and partially in her own channeling that explains that the way manifestation works is that you have to you have to subconsciously believe that you're capable of having the thing that you're calling in. And the things that get in the way of that are the subconscious blocks. It's a lot of this programming that we develop as children as we're growing up that tell us what is achievable or not for us. So by really getting clear on like where am I holding myself back, where do I feel like I'm limited, where do I not feel worthy of the thing that I'm calling in, that's when you can start dialing in to these beliefs, exploring the memories associated with those, like where those beliefs were developed. And you can use manifestation, meditation, you can use meditation and visualization to reprogram those beliefs. The idea being that if you can conjure up the memory vividly in your mind and revisit it and imagine it going differently, your brain really can't tell the difference between this new memory that it's creating versus the old memory. that actually occurred, because it all, honestly, it all kind of feels pretend to our brains, right? Our brain is not good at separating reality from imagination, which is why we get so attached to TV characters, why we cry every why we cried every time someone died in Game of Thrones whom we loved. It's because our brains haven't evolved to understand the difference between fake people on the TV who are not actually our friends in real life, and then the friends that we see in real life, right? So visualization and imagination is really powerful, and what this does is it essentially like rewires the brain. What happens is that your brain starts making connections. So it will start strengthening new neural pathways that create new and improved beliefs that you actually want to happen by consistently remembering, quote unquote, this alternative version of that memory. It starts to strengthen these connections between your brain cells. And after enough time has passed, it will stop using the old pathways. Those will end up dropping away. And that is how you can step into that belief and you can start believing like it's real. Now, part of that means that you're going to encounter tests in the real world where you may get part of your manifestation. Like, let's say you're trying to manifest a partner, you might get somebody who's like everything that you want, but they're emotionally unavailable, or they're married, or they live across the country. I don't know, something like that. And it's up to you to determine, like, okay, this isn't exactly what I want because this very important element is missing. So I'm going to walk away, or I'm going to try and make it work, whatever it is, right? So you get these tests, and then the tests are an opportunity for you to test out these new neural pathways for you to step into that self-worth. And after you get tested enough times, sometimes you'll end up with a quiet period for a bit, which she has called the magic dark. These are like terms that they have codified, trademarked, registered, all of that. So you step through that. And then on the other side is that manifestation. So that is their fundamental formula. And I was so jazzed when I learned about this. I was like, sign me up, because I'm a Pisces. So of course I love anything that's going to make me suffer a little bit. And I started to dive in. I really went just feet first into the deep end, confronting anything that was hiding in my subconscious. And the first limiting belief that I truly uncovered was this idea that dreams were for other people, not for me. It was so heavy. It was such a slap in the face when I realized this. And I realized it because I had always been a cheerleader for everybody in my life. I encouraged people to follow their dreams all the time. And I would always tell them, hey, that backup plan that feels more realistic, that's always going to be there. You can always go back to that. But don't you owe it to yourself to at least try? And yet I would not take that advice. And I didn't realize it at the time because I had thoroughly convinced myself that the paths I had taken in my life were based on things that I wanted. But the truth is that I wasn't being honest, and I wasn't honoring who I authentically was. Right? I was always the witchy friend, and here I am in these very like logical careers. I'm in law, I'm in journalism, where it's all about the facts and it's all about the logical side of things, right? It's all about what can be proven. And I was not really that person naturally. Of course, I am a great analytical thinker. I love strategy. Those things were on point. But I had to leave this huge part of myself out of my work. And so when I discovered that I had this idea that dreams were for other people, not for me, that forced me to then ask myself, well, what are my dreams? What are my dreams if I'm not being realistic? What are my dreams if I'm not being practical? What are my dreams if I believe the way I've told other people that anything is possible and you can always fall onto a backup plan? Well, that was a completely new way of thinking. And here I was in a job that I was not thriving in. I was not good at it. It did not play to my strengths. And although I loved my coworkers and I loved the organization I worked for, I knew I was struggling and I was suffering. So I had to dive in and I had to start asking myself, if I'm not looking for avenues that I'm already qualified for, if I'm taking the sunken cost fallacy out of the equation, this idea that I need to stay on certain paths because I've already put so much time and money into them, what is it that I want? What are my dreams? And I realized that my dream was to be a coach. I know that sounds like kind of anticlimactic now, but at the time, I said to myself, I was like, nobody's a coach. That's not like a real job, like other than like sports. Nobody is actually a life coach. People don't hire that. Life coaches are for celebrities. They're like not, that's not a real job, right? Like that was the mentality that I had around it, which is why it never even entered into my mind. But of course, the truth of the matter is that people have been coming to me for advice my entire life. I had always known exactly what people needed to do. And that's where my gift of claircognizance was coming up. I realized that this was an actual spiritual gift. This was an actual psychic gift. Claircognizance is where you know things because you know them. You don't necessarily know where the idea came from. You don't necessarily like have the work to show for it, right? You can't necessarily write out the equation or write out the steps to explain like how you arrived at that, but you know it is true beyond a doubt. Like you know for a fact it is true. So I knew that this was something I was naturally good at, that I loved. And it occurred to me, why couldn't I do that? Just because I didn't go study psychology, just because I didn't have like certification, like, isn't there a part of me that could easily do this for other people? So that's when I looked at, okay, well, what have I been giving everybody advice on? What's the thing everybody comes to me to that other people would be willing to pay me for? And at the time, that was job hunting. I still do this, of course, but we'll get into that, like where I took a break from it. So at the time, I was like, oh, well, it's about job hunting because I, being naturally an introvert and not a natural networker, I realized, oh my God, this is a skill that I'm teaching everybody to do. I'm teaching my siblings, I'm teaching my friends. What I was teaching them was how to network their way into a job because I had realized over the 10 plus years of my journalism and legal career that anytime I just threw out applications, I had very mixed results. But whenever I was able to go through a networking channel, I would get incredibly fantastic results. And this is coming from somebody who went to a fourth tier law school that has since been shut down, like by the government. Like I'm talking like it got shut down for doing shady shit, my friends. So that hadn't held me back. I had still gotten incredibly cool jobs. I had worked at Bloomberg Law, which for like a national publication. I worked for a national widely known legal nonprofit. Like I'd been able to do these things despite having that law school on my resume. And it's because I was had gotten so good at developing relationships that I taught myself how to use that to my advantage to tap into that hidden job market. So the last job hunt that I had done, I actually did not send in any cold resumes. A cold application, cold resume being like, oh, I randomly saw a job online, so I threw in an application without, them knowing me from anybody. I didn't do that at all. Instead, I networked my way there. I used my contacts to get a job interview, and when I was went through the process, I think it was like 3 interviews. When I didn't get that job, I leveraged the relationships I built through that process to then get a different job at that organization. So it all had all turned out fantastically. And that's what I was teaching other people to do for free because I care about my friends and family. So I realized, oh my God, I think people would pay for that. And like if I really think about it, I could break that down and teach exactly what I was doing because this wasn't something I did naturally, like second nature in a way I couldn't explain. This is something I taught myself over the years. So that was what I had decided to do. I took on a couple pro bono clients because I didn't want to sink a bunch of time or money into something that I didn't love. Again, I'd done that in the past and I was not interested in doing that again. So I took on a friend of a friend of a friend kind of connection for general coaching. And then I took on somebody who was doing their, and this was a total stranger from the internet. I took on somebody who was doing her first job hunt. Like she was fresh out of school, looking for a journalism job and working in a plant shop part time. So I worked with them both for 3 months and I loved it. And I was able to get them some results, able to help them shift their perspectives and their mindset. So I took that as a green light. I was like, I'm ready to go. I'm doing this. So I invested in a business coach because I didn't know the first thing about starting a business. I charged $6,000 to a credit card, which was the most money I'd ever spent on myself. Money I didn't really have in my bank account. I put it on a credit card and I dove in. And a week after I made that charge, I got fired from that job. And I took it as a sign. I said, you know what? I'm just going to do it. Do I advise that now? Not necessarily. I kind of like it was a very it was a very rocky time in my life. It was definitely like trial by fire, but I wouldn't necessarily change it. I learned so much. And the next 8 to 9 months really tricky and difficult, but I had finally at the end of that time period gotten to a point where I could pay my bills from my business. So I wasn't having to pull money out of savings or anything like that. I was actually able to pay my bills. And then COVID-19 hit and job hunting came to a stop. But at that point, I realized hey, I just spent 8 to 9 months figuring out how to start an online business and what to do, what not to do, what works, what doesn't. And so I decided to start teaching people that because a lot of people got laid off, got fired during that time, and they needed a way to make money and make money quickly and make money online. So that's how I started teaching that. I basically taught people how to start those online businesses. And then, of course, from there, I wound up working with all kinds of business owners and all kinds of phases of business ownership. And it became just something I loved. Of course, eventually the economy bounced back and I brought job hunting back in again. And from there, I was doing the online coach content creator thing where I'm like posting, I had something go viral that got the attention of a publisher. The rest is history, right? Like lots of cool things happen. I got into Forbes thanks to somebody like a PR person taking me on as a pro bono client when she was deciding if this was something she wanted to do full time, right? Like there were so many cool things that happened along the way. And a big part of that was that basic manifestation process that I had learned in the beginning and being a member of To Be Magnetics the Pathway, working through their courses and everything. But of course, what was happening in the background with a lot of this is that, yes, I was teaching strategy, but I was also having to teach people mindset and I was having to teach them embodiment practices. And I was actually taking a lot of the concepts that I used in my spirituality, in my witchcraft practice, to apply them to money and to business and to job hunting. And I wasn't calling it that. Of course, eventually I did because I realized, okay, this is not like I'm not being my true authentic self in business by hiding this stuff. I need to actually start talking about it. And so I did. That's when Forbes picked me up and called me the Millennial Money Witch. And I ran with that title, of course, because I was like, that's cool. So that's how I got there. That's how I got this. And what I have learned since then, what I learned building on that found that like very, I don't want to say basic, but I'll say that like foundational manifestation concept, theory, practices, what I really learned from the application of that with myself, with all of my different clients, is that manifesting money is a different kind of manifestation. It requires a different set of skills, it requires a different focus. And I'm going to explain why. Because no matter what amount of money you set, you are limited. You are limited in the mindset of what you are calling in. So, the first part of that means that, like, if you're calling in, let's say you're an entrepreneur and you're like, I want to make $10,000 a month. That's often one of the biggest, like, milestones that entrepreneurs want to hit, $10,000 a month. And when you're setting that, first of all, that's you thinking, like, okay, that's some outlandish thing. So I'm going to like shoot really high. That's naturally a cap. You could always make more than that. And of course, in your mind, you're like, yeah, well, I mean, like minimum $10,000 months. But you're setting that number because that's like, that feels like a reach, or it feels outlandish, or it feels like some big milestone that you need to accomplish before you can go even higher. So you're already naturally capping yourself. The other part of this is that oftentimes it is hard to get our brains on board with an amount of money because it's essentially a theory. It is a concept. It's not like you're going to get a pile of $10,000 in cash dropped on your doorstep. You're not going to see it. It's not like Harry Potter where you've got a vault at Gringotts. You can walk in and look at all your coins. Like, it's going to be numbers on a screen. So it's not something that you can feel a certain way about. You can get excited about it. Of course, in concept, you're like, yeah, oh my gosh, if I had that amount of money, all of the stuff I could buy, this is how my life would change, yada, yada. But it's still theory. And with theory, it's really hard to stay motivated. So what happens is that, let's say you set that goal of $10,000 a month. Let's use a different example. Let's say you are a small time fashion designer. And you're like, all right, here we go. I'm going to make $10,000 this month. And so in the first week, you're like super ambitious. You're posting, you're doing whatever, you're networking. I don't know what you're doing, paying for ads, whatever strategy you're using doesn't even matter. Let's say you sell two like leather jackets in the first week and they're like $600 a piece because you are a designer bitch. So now you're at what? You're at $1,200. And so naturally you go, oh my God, I'm like already so close. All I have to do is sell a few more things. Like, I only have 800 and $8,800 to go. I believe that math is correct. Yes. So you're like, but that's the problem. The problem is that after you celebrate the progress of $1,200, you are looking at what you don't have. You're looking at the gap. So even if, let's say, second week goes really well, you're making money, but then something happens in the third week of the month and you sell nothing. Let's say you cap out at, let's say you don't even get halfway. Let's say it's like 4,500. Okay, you're only $500 short. What happens is that you say, okay, it's the last week of the month. I need to make $5,500 this week in order to meet that goal. And that doesn't feel very good. Now there's pressure. Now you're not like posting for fun. You're not like talking about your work because you're excited and passionate about it. Now it feels like work. And now it feels like you're carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders. Because if you don't make that $5,500, you're a failure. You didn't reach your goal. And that's the problem with manifesting money. Because if you were manifesting anything else, let's say you're trying to manifest, let's say something like, that's equally impressive. Let's say you're trying to manifest a trip to Rome or something. We'll say from the US or Australia, like somewhere that's far away where you'd have to like pay big bucks to get there. So that might be something where you're like, I want a bougie ass trip to Rome, and maybe it's going to cost around the same amount of money, right? But you're manifesting it. You're hoping for like good deals. You're hoping for like recommendations, whatever. If you start seeing progress, let's say you start seeing advertisements, maybe on public transportation or commercials on TV. You just start seeing, like, the Leaning Tower of Pisa. You're seeing, like, Rome this, Rome that. Maybe you're seeing the word Roman, like the name Roman. You start seeing progress, or maybe you start seeing deals online, or you meet somebody who got a crazy cheap plane flight, or they found a really cool hotel that they stayed in for super cheap, right? Like, you start hearing about these things and you get excited. You're like, "Oh my god, it's coming. It's getting so much closer. Yes, I'm like, this is progress. I'm going to get there. I'm seeing it. I believe it more." But the problem, like this compared to the fashion designer example, the issue is that you are making progress, but you are not getting excited about the result. It is hard to say, "Oh my God, I haven't gotten halfway there yet, but I'm so excited because I'm definitely going to do it," because it doesn't feel like it. You're not even halfway to the goal. And so the natural inclination is for you to look at what you don't have. That would be the same thing as if you were starting to see all of this stuff about that trip to Rome and you were just like, "Wow, look at me, some piece of shit. I'm not going to Rome. All these other people have been to Rome. Look at these deals. I'm not buying it because, I'm not there yet." Like, it would be the same kind of thing where now you're shaming yourself because you haven't made the progress toward the full manifestation. So that is the issue. And the reason for this, the final point on why manifesting money is different, is because you're not actually manifesting money. I know that sounds bizarre, but it's because you're trying to manifest the feeling and the result of the money. So the reason you're trying to manifest that $10,000, I'm sure there's a reason under it. It could be because it is proof that people like your clothing. If you're that fashion designer, yeah, this is proof that, like, this is trendy. People like my art. It could be that maybe that is a figure that you think would be impressive to your parents or caretakers who are like, "Go get a real job. Like, you can't live off of this. Like, you need to be able to support yourself. And you can, if you make $10,000 a month, you're like, look at that. I am supporting myself," right? Or it could just be not wanting to feel tight with money. It's never about the figure of money itself. It is always about the results of it and the emotions behind it. Of course, I'm going with the caveat of, like, systemic oppression exists, poverty exists, all of these things are absolutely true. And they are things that work against us. To a certain extent, money can buy you happiness. I completely recognize that. But the difference is that when you get to a certain point, you don't actually care about the money. What you care about is the underlying feeling, which is why money alone can't give that to you. Plenty of celebrities are still miserable. That's why we have tabloids. And plenty of people cry in Jaguars, as they say. Money does not necessarily give you security and safety, to an extent, as I said, to an extent. So the challenge then is not necessarily manifesting this figure that you are pulling out of the air because you think that it's going to make you successful, or it's going to give you freedom, or it's going to give you whatever it is that you actually want. The challenge is learning to create those feelings in your everyday life, to tap into those feelings. So that way you don't have the pressure of money having to make you feel a certain way. That's why it's different. Because a trip to Rome, often that's just because you want a trip to Rome, right? Like, maybe you're Italian and that's like you revisiting your heritage, or maybe it's because you have an affinity for pizza. I don't know. Or you've got an affinity for Roman culture. Maybe you're somebody who thinks about the Roman Empire once a month, right? So, whatever it is, we don't have those same hangups over the other stuff that we're manifesting. That's why manifesting money is different. And that's why it requires a different method. You can't just use those foundational principles. You actually have to dive in to get a little bit more specific regarding how you set your intentions. There's a whole step missing about embodiment, how to really live your life in a way that those new beliefs actually feel believable. And then you have to be able to take action. We're going to get into all of that in the future, but that's what I'm leaving you with today, is that manifesting money is different. If you have struggled to manifest money in the past, it is because you are functioning under the information that it can be manifested like anything else. And I'm not saying it can't, but I am saying it is nuanced and it is tricky. And you need to do much more deep diving and have a much more specific approach to it. And I'm excited to teach that to you. So, if you've enjoyed this episode of the Weekly Witchcast and you'd like to get specific questions answered about these topics or anything else, you need to not only like, subscribe, and share this episode and get the word out there, but you can go join the Witch's Way to Wealth Coven Community. It is an online free membership with my readers, my followers, so you can find people who are on this journey with you. They have the same kind of outlook on how money needs to be approached, not all magical, not all practical, a little bit of both. And get questions answered by me. You can attend these live and get your questions answered. So, on that note, I'm going to log off here and I'll be talking to my members, answering their questions. I hope this was helpful for you. Please feel free to leave comments or reviews, because the more I can tailor this information for you, the better. Thanks for tuning in. Again, I'm Jessie Da Silva, the Millennial Money Witch, and I'm looking forward to talking to you next week.